I'm Jan Poppendick, and I'm going to serve as moderator for this event. And so it's my pleasure to welcome you to the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute, the December Forum. I'd like to start by thanking our co-sponsors, the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice at Temple University, the Barry Commoner Center at Queens, who is our benefactor for the free copies of the issue of the AJPH, the American Journal of Public Health, with the special section on SNAP, which is what we're, I don't know if celebrating is the right word, but observing here today. And of course, the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy. We are observing the 50th anniversary of the White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health. And at the same time, or we are observing it by launching this special section on SNAP. We have 5 of the authors of articles in this special section, 6 if you count me, who will be our panel today to respond to a keynote by Marion Nestle. And just thinking about this, we have a lot of 50th anniversaries in this year. There was the moon shot, and there was Woodstock, and Stonewall, Abbey Road, Sesame Street. It was quite a year. And anniversaries, I think, make us look back and look at the present and look forward, like Dickens' Christmas Carol, with the ghost of SNAP past and the ghost of SNAP present, and maybe we can conjure up a heartening, nourishing ghost of SNAP future. Couple of little housekeeping details. The restrooms are across the hall. Help yourself. There are continuing professional education forms. If you take a form, we ask you to sign up on the sheet that's stapled to the red folder. There's also a form if you're not on our email list and you'd like to give us your email address, you can record it there. And there is a hashtag. Well, hang on a second. The hashtag is Snap50Years for those of you who are social media oriented. My first pleasure is to introduce, pardon me, I'm glad we have slides. I want to alert you to our next forum, which has the wonderful title of Muckrating, Investigative Impact and Local Journalism, New Directions for Media Reporting on Food. If your inbox is anything like my inbox, we're sort of flooded with media reporting on food. So maybe this panel will help us begin to sort out where to look for what's especially important to engage with. All right, now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alfredo Moravia, who is the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Public Health. And you have his bio on the little sheet, and our practice here is not to go on and on in introductions. So, Dr. Moravia, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Jane. I mean, it's great to see all these people here for this symposium, and I thank also Nick Freudenberg for organizing it. It was a great initiative, and really all the praise that I have to do, and that's my introduction, are for Marion Nestle, because that was entirely her initiative. And I just followed and tried to make it happen in the journal. And it started actually a few years ago. And she came once and she said, there's this story of the food basket that they want to use for in SNAP. They want to bring food basket. That's ridiculous. We need to do something about it. And I had this on my to-do list, food basket, Marion Nestle. And after some time, I said, SNAP, okay, but is it that first set of articles? in the I think it was the April issue, and then thanks to Marion, she organized all this incredible set of authors and their contribution, and they were peer reviewed, and we finally published on time. And she's an incredible person to work with, I have to say. And she marshaled everybody, including me, and we got on time. I have to say, what there may have been other series of articles on SNAP in other journals, but maybe one thing I should insist is that, and maybe not everyone knows that, is the reach of AJPH. And we're actually, our publications last year were downloaded or read 3.5 million times. When you compare it to any other journals, we're way on top of that. And this is in part due to the fact that the journal is closely connected to the American Public Health Association. That is a lot of people in the country that are concerned and act and do public health and decide on policies, and they consider the journal as theirs, and they access it enormously. And we've been trying over the last years to make it the most readable possible and the closest possible to the need of people who actually do public health and establish the policies, or are actors at different levels, from the federal to the local government. I mean, the articles of AJPH were cited in scientific reviews 40,000 times last year. That's also a kind of statistics that very few other journals can report. So I think, and we have a podcast which is listened by, this year only 40,000 people have listened to the podcast. So those are all, absolute numbers, but they matters for us because the role, my role, I consider as the editor-in-chief and of the team of editors and the production team and all the connections we have with the APHA, the American Public Health Association teams for communication, for lobbying, for all these groups with which I relate very regularly. I mean, our aim is to make a journal that is readable, accessible, and useful. And so I think that supplement was right on. And again, all the praise goes to Marion Nessel and to the authors. And I hope I served you the best I could. Thank you very much.
So now it's my pleasure to invite Marion up to give her keynote. And you have her bio too, but I just want to say on behalf of, I think, most all the people in this room, thank you, Marion, not just for organizing this special section, but for research that not only has changed our scholarly work and our academic work, but has changed our lives. So welcome, Marion Nessel.
Well, thank you, Jan and Alfredo, for this introduction. Alfredo, I have a completely different version of how this came about. Where are my slides? How do I get to them? Does anybody know how to do this? Yeah, my version of this is really quite different. As I recall, we were having dinner in San Diego, and you said, I get all these papers about SNAP, these manuscripts coming across my desk, and I don't think they're very good. And I don't think that public health people understand what SNAP is about, or how important it is, or why it's so important. Why don't we, and what's it doing in the Farm Bill anyway? Why don't we do something? Anyway, that's my memory of how it came about. So you need to thank him for realizing that public health people don't know very much about this topic and need to. So let me start with a little, first of all, with the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the White House Conference. It's a statement about where we are these days that I have to start with this amazing quotation from President Richard Nixon. Uh, the mind boggles. In May 1969, President Nixon made a speech about hunger in America in which he gave this statement: hunger and malnutrition. It's just embarrassing that we have this problem of hunger and malnutrition in this country. It's intolerable. I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to strengthen the food stamp program, which already existed at the time, and we're going to hold a White House conference on food, nutrition, and health. And in a few months later, the White House conference indeed was held, and it was divided into panels, and the panels made hundreds of recommendations, but quite a few of them were about food stamps. And the main recommendations were that they wanted food stamps to be free because people had to pay for them. They should be supplied at no cost. And people who were really, really poor should get $125 worth of free stamps per month. Those of you who are familiar with the program know that $125 is the average stamp benefit today. They also highly recommended to get rid of food stamps and replace them with cash. We should move to a cash-supported system. That did not happen. The third really important recommendation was that the oversight of food stamps should be moved out of the Department of Agriculture and into the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare because of the Department of Agriculture's conflict of interest. The purpose of the Department of Agriculture is to support commodity agriculture, and to have it dealing with provision of food, food services, food stamps, and nutrition services just didn't make any sense. That also did not happen. So what did happen, I think, needs to be understood in a much, much broader context. And I like to start talking about SNAP by talking about the English Poor Laws of the late 1500s and early 1600s. These were laws that were passed under Queen Elizabeth I, for the purpose of relieving the misery of the poor. The Industrial Revolution had started. There were a lot of poor people. But right from the beginning, the poor laws had purposes that went way beyond relieving the misery of the poor. They were designed to preserve social order so people wouldn't riot on the streets. They were to regulate low-wage labor and keep people forced to work for very low wages because that's all they could get. And of course, in later years, an increasing purpose, which was to mobilize political support for politicians who could use the poor as sort of a way to use dislike and dismay about the poor to gain political support. All of this should sound very familiar hundreds of years later. The philosophy of the English Poor Laws was one that also should sound very familiar. People are poor by choice. They choose to be poor. They're lazy. They don't want to work. They're unworthy of getting any kind of support. And if you do support them, you don't want to give them so much that they will ever become dependent on the support. You want to make sure that they get just barely enough assistance to get by and to keep from rioting, because that's unpleasant, but never enough to get dependent. And then there were other tensions that were also enacted as part of those laws, whether private charity should move in or whether this should be state supported, whether it should be local or national, a question of whether you want to cut. Reform is always a euphemism for budget cuts versus better benefits, whether these should be means tested, only people who qualify should get the benefits versus entitlements. And in almost all cases, food assistance or assistance to the poor was addressing the symptoms of poverty, never the causes. And we see those tensions playing out even to today. So the origins of food stamps started in the United States in the Great Depression, and in dealing with this, those poor law attitudes were brought to the United States with the English settlers and carried out through the beginning of the food stamp program. As Janet Papendick talked about in her book Breadlines Knee Deep in Wheat, still a classic of the genre, and thank you, Jan, for doing that. As she explains in her book, during the Depression, farmers were growing food, but nobody had any money to buy it. Therefore, farmers went out of business or food had to be destroyed. All of that was a mess. While there were a huge amount of food available, people were waiting on bread lines to try to get handouts of food. And food stamps was the method the government came up with to deal with that. It would have two purposes. It would feed the poor, and it would also benefit poor farmers. The way that it worked from 1939 to 1943 was that for every dollar's worth of orange stamps you bought, you were given 50 cents worth of coupons or more stamps to buy U.S. surplus commodities. People had to buy the stamps. Once they had them, they could use them on any food except beer, wine, and liquor, items prepared and eaten on the premises. And in 1941, soft drinks were added to the list of foods that were excluded from food stamps. But that didn't last long. The Second World War took care of unemployment, and food stamps were no longer necessary. But after the war, it was clear that there was a great deal of poverty, and from 1961 to 1964, under the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, there was a pilot project in several states for food stamps that seemed to work out okay. And in 1964, the Food Stamp Act was passed, which let people use the stamps. They still had to buy them, but use the stamps for anything except alcohol, tobacco, and imported foods. There was an attempt to get soft drinks included in the list of excluded products, but that failed. Now, how Johnson got that act to be passed was a major study in politics. Rural Democrats or rural legislators in general were not interested in food stamps, which was largely an urban problem. In those days, rural people were not using food stamps the way that urban people were. Most poor people were in cities. And the urban representatives were not interested in agricultural supports. The rural legislators weren't interested in supporting the urban poor. Johnson brokered a deal and got them to vote for each other's legislation in classic log rolling. And that was the Food Stamp Act of 1964. In 1973, so there was an alliance between farming interests and urban and people who were interested in doing something about the urban poor. The 1973 Farm Bill actually amended the 1964 Food Stamp Act, and then in 1977, the food stamps actually became a title within the Farm Bill as the food stamp. It became the Food Stamp Act of 1977, actually integrated into the Farm Bill. And in 2008, the Farm Bill changed the name of the program from food stamps to SNAP because of its focus on nutrition, because people weren't using the stamps anymore. They were using these electronic benefit cards, not the stamps, and this was to make the program less stigmatizing, ostensibly. So that brings us to the present. SNAP today is a program that serves about 40 million people at a cost of roughly $65 billion a year. Lots of money involved in it. The SNAP is an entitlement, meaning that anybody who can qualify is eligible to receive the benefits, And the average benefit is that magic $125 a month, which 50 years ago was considered to be adequate for food. You just think about what's happened to inflation since then. SNAP absolutely dominates the Farm Bill. And the curious politics of SNAP is that nearly 80% of the funding of the Farm Bill is taken up by SNAP. The programs for helping farmers, crop insurance, commodities, conservation, trade, and all the other things that are supposedly designed to help farmers is only about 20, close to 25% now of the Farm Bill. So there's the Department of Agriculture, whose mandate is to deal with big agriculture, really, having to deal with 80% of the funding that it gets to deal with is SNAP. And that's part of the political problem that SNAP faces today. SNAP is, without question, and you will hear more about this later, demonstrably beneficial to the people who receive it. Even the Department of Agriculture, although this was the Department of Agriculture before the Economic Research Service was moved to Kansas, the Department of Agriculture, even it says that the people survived the depression of 2008 because they had food stamps and that cushioned it, and that SNAP has a very impressive multiplier effect, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 for every dollar spent on SNAP. The community benefits by an additional 50 cents or a dollar on top of that. Today, under the Trump USDA, there's grudging admission of the benefits of SNAP. I took this off their website yesterday, and it says that the program helps low-income families, states and local economies, and businesses and workers. And the main point that this, I know you can't read it, but the main point that it makes over and over and over again is that SNAP forces people to become self-sufficient, and that's what we want. We don't want them dependent. We want them self-sufficient. The great beneficiary of food stamps, of the SNAP program, because of the way it works, is retail stores. More than 80% of SNAP dollars are spent in retail grocery establishments, and the grocers are the biggest supporters of keeping the program exactly the way it is. Advocates who are concerned about improving SNAP have a great deal to say about what ought to be done to improve it and what could be done to improve it. I was on the SNAP to Health Committee, which was one of these reports that has dozens and dozens of recommendations about what should be done to improve it. The Department of Agriculture over the last few years has published articles about how you could reconfigure SNAP so that it would not promote obesity among participants, and taking even a broader look at what SNAP could do to improve the food choices of recipients. But that's not where the Department of Agriculture's interest is these days. The Department of Agriculture has a very clear, focused, and absolutely relentless interest in destroying SNAP, reducing the amount of money that's spent on it, and getting as many people off of it as possible, as quickly as possible. Its argument for doing it is that we're cutting budget and this is a good thing. And lots of people have had lots to say about this. Trump wants to take from the poor and give to the wealthy, despite the fact that what is being done is going to take lots and lots of people off. So let me just run through some of the efforts to reduce SNAP enrollments and therefore reduce costs. One is the public charge provision that was put forth by the Department of Homeland Security, which says that if you are a non-citizen and you get public benefits, including SNAP, you are therefore putting your application for citizenship at risk, and you are making yourself vulnerable to deportation. This alone has had an enormous effect. Immigrants who are aware of the public charge provision are abandoning public nutrition services, withdrawing from these programs because they're afraid that they will be caught and deported and that they will lose any chance of ever becoming citizens. A really big one was changing the work requirements to toughen them up and make them more stringent, even though many people on SNAP are already working. Now the work requirements are even tougher. This also had an immediate effect on cutting program enrollments and is expected to have a big impact on getting people off of it. And then there are really tiny things, like this heating and cooling standard allowance that allowed people who are on SNAP to get a break on energy costs, a little tiny thing that's been discontinued. And then the most recent one is the proposal to end the loophole in SNAP, which allowed anybody who was on some other food assistance program to be automatically enrolled in SNAP. And this alone is expected to push about 3 million people off of food stamps, and also risks taking about 1 million children getting from losing their automatic free lunches. So this has been a relentless series of actions, one after the other. So SNAP is a target these days. It's under siege, and it's an absolute target. And it's a target of people who believe that people are poor by choice. It's a target of people who want to end any kind of dependency, who want to cut funding and enrollment for these programs, who want to keep people working at low wages for as long as they can, and to mobilize political support among the Trump base. So that, and the USDA goes along with this freely and enthusiastically. In a statement about the most recent cuts and efforts, Secretary Perdue of the Department of Agriculture said, now we're restoring the original intent of SNAP. We're giving people a second chance, but we're not establishing a way of life for people. We want to cut off any possibility that people will become dependent on these benefits. So that's where we are, and these are the kinds of things that were discussed by the authors of papers in this special issue of the American Journal of Public Health. We have 6 of the authors here with us today, me and 5 others, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say, because I think their papers are terrific, and I hope you'll take one of those issues and read it carefully. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I am particularly grateful to the members of this panel who traveled to get here for a very brief allocation of time. We struggled and thought about how to do everything we wanted to do this morning within the confines of our time period, and so we asked these authors to travel. Bryn came from Washington, D.C., and Mariana came from Philadelphia, via Santa Fe, did you say? And so I'm grateful to you for making the trip, and to all of our authors for being willing to take on this challenge of responding to Marion's keynote and a question that I will pose for you in a very brief period of time, because we do want to leave time for comments and questions from the audience. So just to make sure you have people's bios, but just in case you don't know who is who, that's Nick Freudenberg down there on the end, the director of this institute. And next to him is Jennifer Conrad from NYU. And then there's Mariana Tilton from Drexel University, and Evan Cohen from here at the Institute. And this is Bryn Keith Jennings from the Center on Budget and Poverty Policy Priorities, an institution to which I am eternally grateful because I am a regular consumer. Raise your hands if you're a regular consumer of the, yes, okay. I think many of us are in that. So I'm going to start with Nevin because in a way he's picking up where Marion left off. In your paper, Nevin, you wrote about the termination of the state's ability to seek waivers in various ways for able-bodied adults without dependents. So now that was a proposal at the time that you wrote the paper, but as you know, it's now a final rule, which means it's happening. It will go into effect, in about 45 days in April. So could you tell us what the impact will be on New York City? And then maybe tell us a little bit about the differences in neighborhoods that you describe in your paper. What advice you would give to the city in terms of analyses they may need to do and actions they should take to try to minimize the able waiver termination damage.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Real close to your mouth on that one.
Okay. Thanks. So thank you very much, Shannon and Marion, and thank you for turning out on this rainy morning. The main idea of the article I wrote in the journal is that while all of the things that Marion said about national level SNAP policy is really critical, there's also a specific impact at the local level that we need to pay attention to if we're advocates or administrators of the SNAP program. And I looked at 3 different impacts in New York City as examples of the neighborhood impacts of SNAP. One is that we live in a spatially heterogeneous city. New York is remarkable because every block is a different neighborhood and has a different composition of people and different landscape. And that's really important in terms of who enrolls in the SNAP program. And I looked at neighborhoods with low numbers of people who are eligible for SNAP but not enrolled in the program. And not surprisingly, as Marion pointed out, there's fear in immigrant neighborhoods of enrolling in public programs. And so neighborhoods with lots of immigrants have very low eligible but very high eligible but not enrolled rates of populations. And I looked also at food costs, which are heterogeneous throughout the cities. And as you know, in neighborhoods like Chelsea, where there are large public housing developments with very low-income people, food costs are very high, and that disparity has an impact on the average $125 a month that you get from SNAP. It's more unaffordable in places like Manhattan than in places in Queens or Brooklyn where people are getting SNAP. And the third point in responding to your question is that jobs and people are spatially mismatched. It's a very common term in planning. People don't live where the jobs that they can get are available. And so when this able-bodied without dependent rule takes effect and people are thrown off of SNAP after 3 months, that will have a disproportionate impact on certain neighborhoods where people really can't get jobs because the jobs are in other places in the region and not in their neighborhood. And Stephen Banks estimated that this would throw about 75,000 people off the SNAP rolls in New York City. We'll have to measure that and see whether that's a low or high estimate. But that's going to be really significant in certain neighborhoods where jobs aren't available. And New York City has gotten for 2019 a waiver from the ADAWD rules in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, Upper Manhattan, and a couple of neighborhoods in Queens where unemployment is higher than average. Those waivers will be eliminated. And so what can a city like New York do? I suggested one thing in the article, which is to use early warning reporting requirements by companies who are expected to close or lay off workers, to identify neighborhoods where targeted outreach would help people move into SNAP as soon as they lose their jobs. But more proactively, the city needs to think about the planning process and how the loss of entry-level manufacturing and other decent jobs can affect people who are potentially at risk of losing their jobs and needing SNAP support. So, for example, in the Jerome Corridor neighborhood of the Bronx. The city rezoned the neighborhood to build affordable housing, but that rezoning has put at risk hundreds of small businesses, many of them in car repairs, which may lose their ability to stay in the neighborhood, and that will have an impact. The city rezoned Willets Point in Queens. The same issue is really at play. Willets Point was filled with small manufacturing businesses that employed local people. And so my advice would be for the city to proactively look at its rezoning efforts and other policies that might eliminate the types of jobs that people who are currently receiving SNAP can fit into and need to have to make a living. And Marion's point about the fact that ABAW SNAP recipients, many of them have jobs. Many of them work off the books part-time. Many of them are between jobs but are really anxious to get work. So it's not a group of people who are unemployed for their laziness or desire to be out of work. It's because the economy in their communities doesn't support good-paying full-time jobs.
Thank you. Let me have your mic. I think I'm going to do this sitting down rather than popping up and down. So, Bryn, I'd like to turn to you. One of the recommendations that occurred in your paper and virtually almost all the papers was to increase the SNAP benefit, and I'm grateful to Marion for pointing out that it's now roughly what was recommended 50 years ago. So I'd like you to comment on the feasibility of and impact of a substantial increase and what we learned or what we can learn from the experience when it was raised as part of the ARRA, the response to the Great Recession.
Sure, thank you. Good to be here with everyone. So yeah, as I think Marion did a great job in explaining SNAP and all the important impacts it has, which are especially powerful given how modest benefits are, on average about $125 per month per person, as she mentioned. We see that SNAP reduces poverty, it reduces food insecurity when people struggle to consistently afford enough food for a healthy diet. And we also see it has positive impacts on health, despite that modest size. There's also a lot of research showing that benefits for many households don't give them enough to meet their basic food needs. Some of those look at the benefit calculation and whether or not that provides sufficient and accounts for, as you mentioned, the different costs of food in different areas and a number of other assumptions that are in that. Some of it also looks at what's known as the benefit cycle, when participants towards the end of the month run out of SNAP benefits as well as their other income, and we see consumption of food declines and other negative impacts. So as you mentioned, in 2009, Congress, as part of the Recovery Act to stimulate the economy and help households who were affected by the Great Recession recover, approved a number of measures, including an across-the-board benefit increase in SNAP benefits. All households received, on average, about 15 to 20% increase in benefits, and that lasted through 2013, when the increase ended, and every household, well, almost all households except Hawaii, for complicated reasons, experienced a benefit cut, which really gave researchers the ability to look at both what were the impacts of having that benefit increase and what were the impacts of experiencing that cut. And they saw that with the increase, households were able to buy more food, as you might expect. It reduced food insecurity, and especially comparing during that time when many households were still struggling, it had a protective impact against the lingering effects of the Great Recession. And it also started to minimize that benefit cycle of, we saw less of an impact on food consumption throughout the month, which some people will look at the benefit cycle and sometimes think that it might be an issue of budgeting, and this really suggests that, no, it's really an issue of households trying to stretch their benefits, but they just aren't big enough to stretch all the way. And similarly, with when the benefit increase ended, we also saw negative impacts as well. So it really provides powerful evidence that increasing benefits will have positive effects and that cutting them, as we know will happen or potentially will happen under the enormous threat SNAP is under, will likely lead to increased food insecurity and hardship for households.
Thank you. That summarizes it succinctly. Jennifer, I'd like to turn to you. In your fascinating article about the efforts to get expenditure data and the supermarket data released for researchers and for the public, you've helped us understand some of the barriers to that kind of transparency. So one question I have for you is this fight over? It looked pretty definitive in terms of what you reported in the article. And can you tell us a bit of the history about how industry lobbied to protect its privacy?
So I'm a public health lawyer, so my perspective is different, and I have a challenge for researchers at the end of my paper. But lucky enough, when Marion approached me, the Supreme Court was hearing a case on SNAP redemption data. So there are three types of data when a SNAP participant redeems, well, when they use their benefits. The sales data, which is kind of just numbers, how much is being spent at what time and where. The food expenditure data, which is not collected by the government, and then redemption data, which is how much retailers are making on the transaction and then nationally. And a newspaper in South Dakota tried to find out what retailers in South Dakota were making through SNAP to understand if there were food desert issues, fraud, and other issues related to how much money they were making. And the USDA refused to release the data, saying that they promised retailers they would keep it confidential. So they had a FOIA request, which is a Freedom of Information Act request. They brought it to the courts. This went on for many years. This is almost a decade fight to try to get this redemption data. The courts ruled on both sides throughout, and it actually went to the Supreme Court to determine what confidential means under FOIA. But what ended up happening was the Eighth Circuit, which is a federal appellate court, right, which is the highest level before the Supreme Court, said, USDA, you must release this data. And so the USDA put out a public comment period and said, please tell us whether you think we should release this data or if it should remain confidential. And in the meantime, the retailers actually lobbied Congress to secretly add in the Farm Bill a provision which was not even reported, even though this is a pretty major thing. It was reported as a technical change, yet it actually prohibited the release of the data that was at issue in the lawsuit, which is pretty amazing. It was just a secret change in Congress. And luckily, we're talking about a newspaper, so they have investigative journalists who were really uncovering what was going on. But this news was happening all in the Dakotas, so it was not even being really broadcast nationally. Luckily, they had a USA Today relationship, and so some of it did get out. But what ended up happening was the Supreme Court determined that the USDA had, in fact, said it was confidential, that they would keep this data confidential. So not only was it blocked by Congress in the Farm Bill, but it was also now blocked under FOIA. So in terms of finding out what specific retailers are making and the money only, Congress would have to change the law in order to either change FOIA or change the law related to what the USDA is promising to retailers. It could say, retailers, if you'd like to participate in SNAP and make a lot of money, we need to be able to disclose this data. Of course, the fear is retailers might say, we don't want to participate if we have to disclose the data. I don't know the answer. That's a great research question to find out. In terms of the food expenditure data, which is not part of this lawsuit at all, so what are people purchasing? Researchers across the country have used many methods to try to understand this, including data sets and Hanes and doing bag checks and buying Nielsen data. That is not part of this lawsuit. So again, the USDA or Congress could change the law and say that we are going to collect this data. This would require changes at the retail level to be able to collect the information. They don't actually collect this information. So that would be require changes to the EBT machines or the registers. But I think the biggest issue, as Marion showed, everyone's constantly attacking SNAP participants. And no one talks about the retailers. What are the retailers doing? Very few papers have shown amazing things that retailers do offer discounts on sugary beverages or market sugary beverages during times when people are using their SNAP benefits. So my challenge is for researchers to please focus on what retailers are doing, and we need to also investigate what's happening online. Now online SNAP redemption is possible, and that's a whole world of research that's available to us. We could also challenge the USDA to start collecting the online purchase data, because that would be feasible as well. So there's a lot of avenues to actually try to get this data, but some of them would require Congress to make changes.
Thank you. I realize I should have been giving you the article titles. So Jennifer's article is entitled Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program Data, Why Disclosure is Needed. And Nevin's was, wait a minute here, SNAP at the Community Scale, How Neighborhood Characteristics Affect Participation in Food Access. And Bryn's, with co-authors, was Links of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program with Food Insecurity, Poverty, and Health, Evidence and Potential. And now I'm going to turn to Nick. And our paper is called College Students and SNAP, the New Face of Food Insecurity in the United States. And Nick, my question for you is, why has food security among college students become a problem in recent years? And it's a double-barrel question, which we're forbidden in research, but this isn't research, so I can do it. Many campuses respond to reports of rising food insecurity with a new campus food pantry. What are the pros and cons of this approach compared to enrolling students in SNAP and advocating easier access to SNAP for college students?
Great, thanks. And my co-authors are Jan Poppendiek and Sarah Golder-Grab, who's at the Hope Center for College, Community and Justice at Temple University. And Sarah's colleague, Christy Baker-Smith, is over here. Thanks for coming. And the Hope Center and our group here at the CUNY School of Public Health are working with CUNY over the last several years to improve our response to food insecurity here at CUNY. So much of what we have learned comes from that experience, and the Hope Center has surveyed hundreds of colleges around the country. And what those studies show is that somewhere between 25% and 50% of college students, depending on the campus and the population sampled and the survey, are food insecure. And that is using the USDA definitions, and that's a much higher level of food insecurity than in the population as a whole. And one of the things I've learned from my colleagues and from our own work here at CUNY is that while poverty and income inequality are the underlying cause of food insecurity and hunger for all populations, each population has a different path to getting there. And so if we're looking at immigrant populations or low-wage workers or mothers with children or seniors, it's a different set of policies and social and economic factors that drive them into food insecurity. And we as researchers have an obligation and opportunity to understand those particulars so that we can respond effectively. So for college students, we found 5 reasons why food insecurity is higher than among the general population. The first is that there are more low-income students in college today than a decade or two ago. In 2016, 39% of college students came from families at 130% of the poverty level, whereas in 1996, it was only 28%. So the starting point is part of the reason, an important reason for the rise in food insecurity is a policy success in getting more low-income students into college. And we should not forget that. That's an underlying cause. Second, colleges are more expensive. At the same time, more low-income students came into colleges. Colleges cost more. Between 1989 and 2016, the price for a four-year degree doubled, even after inflation. That's largely because of tax cuts for the wealthy and withdrawing public support for public universities. Third, the purchasing power and level of funding for Pell Grants, the largest federal student support, didn't keep up with inflation and the rising population. And so federal assistance actually provided a lower level of support. Fourth, it was harder to pay for college by working. That's both because of the rise in low-wage jobs and the minimum wage not keeping up and the minimum wage not applying to many of the jobs that college students took. And so it became harder for students to support themselves. Federal work study had a variety of flaws and funding didn't keep up with the increase in population. And finally, partly as a result of state and local cutbacks in support for public colleges, colleges had fewer resources to address the social needs of their students. So these 5 reasons explain why college food insecurity is a policy problem. It comes about as a result of food policy, higher education policy, tax policy, and work policy. And it's the concatenation of those things that lead to the increase in food security. And I think for us at CUNY, where, again, between 40 and 50% of our students are food insecure using the USDA definitions, what strikes us most poignantly is that for many of our students, they're food insecure because they've chosen to come to school, because they have to pay for college and books and subway fares, and that means they have to choose between getting a degree and getting dinner, an unconscionable choice that our society puts in front of really the success stories of New York and the nation. Your second question, Jan, was about food pantries. And food pantries are a very attractive choice for colleges and universities and foundations to address food insecurity. And there are lots of good things about food pantries. They're visible, accessible, concrete, low threshold of service, and they actually put food in the mouths and stomachs of hungry students. CUNY has food pantries on most of its campuses, and many other schools do too. They're also they're attractive option. They don't cost a lot, and they're a visible demonstration of a university's commitment. But I think what we've come to see and what the Hope Center has come to see is it really is a Band-Aid solution. Food pantries can never address the level of food insecurity of college students. And it becomes a problem when it becomes a substitute for more meaningful solutions. And those more meaningful solutions might be ensuring that more college students enroll in SNAP. The enrollment rates for college students, those who are eligible for SNAP, is much lower, about 31%, according to a recent study by the Government Accountability Office, than for the population as a whole, where it's closer to 70 or 80%. And that's in part because SNAP has all sorts of rules. The rules are confusing. SNAP office staff don't always know about the rules, and certainly campuses don't. So enrolling more eligible students in SNAP would go a big step towards it. And I think what we've come to conclude in closing at CUNY is that a positive role for food pantries is to become a hub for services, a place to connect students to SNAP and other public benefits, a place to educate students about food, a place to enroll students in cafeteria voucher programs, and a place to prepare students to be advocates for more effective responses to food insecurity. Thank you.
Okay, and now I'm going to turn to Mariana, who is one of the authors of Recommendations from SNAP Participants to Improve Wages and End Stigma. And I understand there are some members of the audience who may recently have viewed the film A Place at the Table, and you will recognize Mariana as the founder of Witnesses to Hunger, and it was with two of the witnesses that you co-wrote this paper. So, Mariana, my question for you, okay, I've lost my cheat sheet here. You make a strong case for universal basic income in lieu of our current patchwork of inadequate means-tested programs. For me, this raises what I think of as the advocate's dilemma, the anti-hunger advocate's dilemma. A significant increase in SNAP benefit seems far more attainable to me than a basic income guarantee. My time and energy are finite. All our time and energy are finite. Shall I work for improvements in SNAP and resist the cuts? Or shall I set that work aside to work for an income guarantee?
Thank you so much for the great question, and thank you very much for including us in this special issue. For us, it's a great privilege and honor, so thanks for inviting us in. And I came because I just wanted to hang out with all of you cool people. So I first want to give a shout out and acknowledge and respect, first of all, that we're on Lenni Lenape land. Secondly, I'd like to acknowledge and respect my co-authors, Tiana Gaines Turner and Joanna Cruz. Both of them are members of Witnesses to Hunger and have taught me so much. Tiana Gaines Turner is a black woman, a mother of 4, who's married. Joanna Cruz is Latina, white presenting, and a married mother of 3. I'm white and have never been on SNAP. The members of Witnesses I have been working with them for over 11 years actually now, and they've taught me a lot of what the experience of participating in SNAP is about. And so all of any good things in that article really should be attributed to Tiana and to Joanna and other members of Witnesses. When I first started working with members of Witnesses 11 years ago, it was 2008, early 2008. It was a participatory action program. They were receiving cameras. I was giving them cameras. They were taking photographs of their experiences, and I said, you use your camera as your voice, as your friend, to tell the press, the public, and legislators what you want them to know about you and your life and about public assistance programs. And so they were thinking that was pretty amazing and were excited about the idea. And they said, well, I don't really know what to advocate for, Mariana. What do you advocate for? And also I'm a researcher, I'm an epidemiologist as well, and I said, well, we say that food stamps are good medicine, but the dose is not enough. Or we advocate to improve food stamp benefits. And most of the women that I spoke with were absolutely horrified. Mariana, that's ridiculous. How could you possibly do that? And for me, it was a total flip of my own perspective and my own understanding about what I was even advocating for. The reason that they didn't like that idea was that, first of all, they always felt like they were stigmatized for using food stamps, now called SNAP, and just because they use an EBT card doesn't mean that the people behind them in line can't see them pull out the EBT card and still have a sense of superiority over SNAP recipients. So they see SNAP, first of all, as an instrument of stigmatization of people who are poor. Secondly, it lets their bosses off the hook from paying them a meaningful living wage. So to advocate for increasing SNAP benefits, while on the surface could be really good, is actually advocating for bosses or corporations and businesses to pay their workers less than what they're worth and not acknowledge their skill set. And thirdly, the SNAP benefits are never enough. We've all known that. They're tired of running out of SNAP benefits at the 3rd week of the month, and the members of Witnesses and Joanna and Tiana are incredible and savvy, brilliant mathematicians when they're at the grocery store. And so it has nothing to do with their capabilities of stretching the dollar. They know how to stretch their dollar more than really any other person who has never participated in SNAP. So basically, from their perspective, SNAP is not only a target and a way to stigmatize people who are poor, but it's an instrument that can be weaponized against them, and especially weaponized against people of color. So what they would like is, of course, to be treated equal to everybody else. And so in order to do that, we have to think in the future. We have to think beyond what we have in place. And so from my perspective, back to your question, Jan, which is, should you fight for, should you protect SNAP and to work on increasing it because that's probably more realistic than what's in the present? Or should we be fighting for universal basic income, which treats everybody equally with a sense of equanimity and respect and cannot be weaponized because it would be weaponizing against our own selves? I would say work on universal basic income. Because where do you want to put your life on the line? You want to put your life on the line for equanimity, for justice, for egalitarianism. That's where it ought to be. And I know you're looking at your clock, but you talked about SNAP past, SNAP present, SNAP future. UBI, Universal Basic Income, is the future of what SNAP could be, because that means abundance for everyone. And it calls us all to account and how much we're doing to advocate for that. Thank you.
Well, I thank the panel for both the substance of their lively answers and for keeping to a pretty rigid time schedule. It's 10:40, and that means it's time to turn this over to our studio audience here to see what questions you have. At the end, I'd like to reserve, 4 or 5 minutes to give each panel member a chance to identify his or her I'm learning to make the transition, fighting a rearguard action, but anyway, their top priority for the future. Okay, let's start back. Okay, are we going to circulate the mic? Go ahead. Here comes the mic. I better stand up here where I can see.
I have a question about food pantries at schools. I'm at the new school, so the food pantry, they're using the city system. So you'll receive large cans of spaghetti sauce, or that you can't open when you're on campus. Some others will put in money for stuff that's really useful for students, especially if you're in finals, you're on campus, like potato chips, maybe some energy bars, stuff like that. Is there a way now that these are beginning to be popular to capture the data of what is being purchased or stocked in these food pantries?
So I know best about City University of New York, and Christy, maybe you know other systems. And like it's so often the case in big public systems, the food pantries at CUNY are very decentralized. And so each pantry does its own ordering. We do have a relationship with the Food Bank of New York, and they help CUNY to get better food, including, fresh food and not cans. But in our system, the pantries face inadequate space, inadequate staffing. There are a lot of reasons why it's easier to have cans of food than it is to have the choice pantry model, and those are system and policy issues at the central university level. In our view, CUNY can do more. Anything to add about other systems?
So there are a number of different ways that food pantries operate, and I think Nick described really well what's happening with CUNY. There are, for example, we've been working with the Houston Food Bank, and one of the things they're doing is for the Houston Community College, they have a special program. And the food bank itself is for the whole city of Houston, which allows them to have a little bit more purchasing power, a little bit more space, those kinds of things. But a lot of this is logistical. Storing fresh food is a real issue, particularly on a college campus. This is one of the things that we think is one of the reasons the first thing colleges do when they realize there's a food insecurity crisis is they put a food pantry together. Is often they're in a closet, or it's, faculty members having granola bars in their desk. that's usually where it starts, and that's because that's pretty easy to get off the ground. To think about meaningful ways for it to support students at certain times of the year, finals, that's a great point. Takes a lot more infrastructure, which is a real issue. Yeah.
Okay, good. I see a hand back here. Here comes the mic.
Hi, my name is Tutu and I work for Growing My Sea. I'm just curious. I'm just curious about. I'm thankful for your work at the Witness. But I often find that our conversations around SNAP usually happen with people who aren't on SNAP. I'm thinking about what would it look like to have the people who are actually benefiting from SNAP being at the table and being at the head of the conversation, not just getting data from them, but making decisions and making policy and deciding about research that should be done. What does it look like for us in that room to encourage that? What does it look like for us to advocate at a government level for that to happen?
I'm sorry for the hearing impaired if I'm not talking loud enough. I don't think this works. Thank you very much for the question. That's what we have been spending 11 years trying to do, is to get members, people who have participated in the SNAP program, to speak directly to legislators and to advocate for themselves and to try to get them into the lead. It has proven to be very difficult. We've had members of witnesses testify in front of Congress, testifying in front of Paul Ryan. They have been in hundreds of news stories to talk about SNAP, have been trying to break in and trying to lead that effort. But I think it takes, it's not something that's going to take just 11 years. I think it takes a whole mindset change. We have to remember and understand that Congress and our current government has been set up over, it's the legacy of colonization. It's the legacy of slavery. It's set up for white landowners and for people to own things. And so whenever you're advocating on SNAP, you're fighting against the big food corporations, you're fighting against big ag, and you're fighting against the grocers, and you're even fighting against your own legislators. And even our best supporters for SNAP will never take on issues such as restricting sugar-sweetened beverages because they get money from the soda industry, American beverage industry. So really, our current government systems are set up to support corporations and to support capitalism as it has been over the generations. So I think I think we need a lot more people to speak up, and I think researchers need to take a step back, change the way that they organize or reorganize our work, organize our research, change the way we ask our questions. But it's a deeper issue. I'd be happy to talk with you offline about some of our struggles and challenges.
Take the mic back there to Daniel. Daniel, raise your hand so that the mic, and while the mic is on the way, well, no, it's going to get there. I have a pet peeve about SNAP policy that I have to get in here sometime, but I'll do it later.
Hi. To the extent that healthy agriculture is a public health issue, and as been mentioned, that SNAP is the largest program by order of magnitude in the USDA portfolio. What are the implications of SNAP for farmers and farm workers beyond the low millions of dollars of SNAP that's redeemed at farmers markets and the pennies on the dollars that farmers get when their products are sold through the retail channels? Thanks.
No?
I can just say a few things. I think at our institute, we're working on something called the Good Food Purchasing Program, a national program to set standards for using public money for food, and it includes standards around nutrition, around workers, including both workers in the agricultural sector and the productive sector, around climate, around animal welfare, and around community economic development. And the notion that public money on food, including the money spent on SNAP, should be used to further public good, including benefiting farmers, making farming a more sustainable way of living, I think that's an important way to go and would be worth further discussion.
There are also programs around the country to provide support to people on SNAP to help them pay for food purchased from farmers markets. And they're all very small scale. The subsidies are often too small to make a difference for a family. And if those programs could be scaled up and redesigned to make them more effective, I think that could have an impact on channeling SNAP dollars to producers.
So I'm Linda Laviolette from the New York State Department of Agriculture. And getting back to how the SNAP program could benefit farmers, Grow NYC is one of our biggest helps in that regard. I mean, their farmers market program redeems almost $1 million in SNAP money a year. But the FMMP program is pretty much responsible for keeping our farmers markets running in the state. We have the second largest number of farmers markets in the United States after California. And without the FMMP program, which was started here in New York, those farmers markets would pretty much close.
Right, and I'm good. Can we get a mic here? You.
Hi, my name is Armando. I work for the Community Food Bank of New Jersey as a nutrition educator. And my question has two parts. For Jennifer, I work for one of the largest retail stores in the United States for over a decade. And I think it's pretty easy for them to track where the money is coming from or how the money is, how much money is spent through EBT cards. I'm sure I would find the answer if I read your article, which I have not yet. Why are they not releasing this information? Why is it important to read this information? And I think I'll start from there.
So the USDA does, and the retailers know exactly how much is being spent. The one thing they don't track is what foods are being purchased. So putting that aside, the reason they don't want to release the data is because then it will hurt competition for them. They want to keep other retailers out of those neighborhoods that would now provide competition. But that shows how important this data is, because they can now have a monopoly in their neighborhoods. They can raise prices. They can do these marketing tricks, during SNAP times, and there's no other retailer competing for SNAP dollars. So they don't want competition in their neighborhoods. And this is public information. I'm not, kind of twisting it for a theory. That is the reason, is because they don't want to increase competition for SNAP dollars. So it's important to be able to have competition for SNAP so you can have prices and have a real market versus just a monopoly.
Good. So we have 6 minutes left, and if I count myself, we have 6 panelists. So we could give each panelist a minute to say what your priorities would be looking forward, and I'm going to start. This is small, but important. Oh, I need the mic. Well, all right, I'll use this one. Okay. Small but important. Both the able-bodied adults without dependence rules and the college student SNAP rules specify you got to be working 20 hours a week. 20 hours a week or 80 hours a month is the cutoff point where institutions, employers, become liable for having to have their benefits include pension and the benefits that full-time workers get. It's an ERISA regulation. So it's like, if you set that regulation at 18 hours a week or even 19 hours a week, many more jobs would be available. It's cruel, and we need to fix that so that either employers need to get more creative about how they count the hours, or we need to change that eligibility threshold work hours. I mean, I'd like to get rid of the work requirements, but in the meantime, could we not legislate a total catch-22?
I have many. I agree with your comments that I think SNAP is a program that responds to larger issues in the economy, and we talk about that a lot in our article. And so I think in an ideal world, we wouldn't need SNAP. Employers would pay workers a living wage. People would have access to health care, to child care, to transportation, everything they need. But within SNAP, along with increasing benefits, one of the things I would put in, along with defending the program from the cuts that are looming and proposed cuts that are coming up, I would also want to increase access. Right now there's a lot of eligible people, and you mentioned this a bit, who are not accessing SNAP, and people who are accessing SNAP and falling through the cracks when they have to recertify. So states are already doing a lot to try to improve that, but I would build on that success as well.
So, building on that, I would hope that cities around the country would begin to look in greater detail at the communities that really are vulnerable under the current administration's policies around immigration, and also because of the new cuts that are coming in. And the article that I wrote only has a few ideas from New York City, largely, for how cities can respond, but there are lots of innovations in policy that can focus on neighborhoods that are particularly vulnerable to SNAP cuts.
Work. Back to your question, Jan, originally of should you do UBI or SNAP, both and. So on SNAP, we absolutely have to advocate harder for increasing the SNAP grant amount to up from the thrifty food plan to the low-cost food plan. And secondly, I really would love to help get other people interested in universal basic income and the potential of that. I know it's probably hard to understand, hard to figure out, but this concept has been around for hundreds of years. It was brought up 50 years ago at the White House. Nixon was considering it. George McGovern was considering it. Let's start to investigate and learn more about it. Thanks for having me.
I think the ultimate problem is the food companies, not retailers, but Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and those food companies. They're lobbying to legislators to keep SNAP how it is in all policies, and then we can even talk about guns and any other product that is the victim of lobbying. So I'd like Congress to reverse Citizens United, make it so there are cuts, there are limits to the amount of corporate lobbying, and we would fundamentally change America to help people and not corporations.
Focusing on the population, we wrote about college students. I agree with the both and. These are complex problems. There's not a single solution. We need a portfolio of interventions, and we need to figure out how to integrate them. So my portfolio for ending food insecurity on college campuses, which I think is an achievable goal, would be an aggressive SNAP enrollment campaign created and led by students that combined both enrollment in the existing SNAP and a sharp critique of the policies that limit the potential effect of that. Second, free college tuition, a suggestion that's on the agenda and would make it much easier for college students to afford. The Excelsior program in New York State is a step in the right direction, but has severe limitations that prevent particularly the neediest students from benefiting from it, and so we need changes in that program. Third, some advocates have talked about bringing the free school breakfast and lunch program to college campuses, particularly community colleges. In other countries, access to higher education, including food, is part of the social benefit. We ought to be exploring that. And finally, raising the minimum wage, not just for, that would not just benefit college students, but all people, and make it into a livable wage instead of the currently inadequate minimum wage.
We are at 11 o'clock. This is amazing. But I want to invite you to hang around a little bit, interact with the panel members and the keynote speaker and our editor-in-chief, and make sure you eat up all of the fruit back there. You know how I feel about food waste. So please make yourselves at home at the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute, and we'll see you at our next forum in January.